I'm excited to start this memorization process with you. Today, what I wanted to do is just give you an overview of the passage, as well as give you the chance to read it and get to know it, be familiar with it, even ask questions about it before we begin memorizing. So we're going to memorize Psalm 62 together. And so I'm going to go ahead and just read through the psalm one time and then make a few comments about why we chose this psalm, make a few notes about the outline of the psalm, and then talk about the method that we're going to use to work on Bible memory together. And we'll just use today as kind of an introduction for those things. So Psalm 62, 1 through 12 says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Selah. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock. My refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up, they are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work." Okay, Psalm 62. So why memorize this psalm right now? Well, as you can see, even in the psalm, David is in the midst of a trial. He's in the midst of difficult situation, difficult circumstance. And one of the main questions that we always want to know the answer to, particularly in the situation that we've been in recently with this international virus, is we want to know, how long is this going to last? How long are we going to have to wait? How long are our lives going to be affected? And one of the main things that this psalm encourages us to do is to wait for God. He says it in verse 1. He says it again in verse 5. And then he says in verse 8, as the conclusion to that idea of waiting, trust in him when? At all times, O people. There's not a time or a place or a length of time in which our God is not worthy of our trust. He's set the times sovereignly so that we may fear before him. And so in the middle of trial, the question is not necessarily how long. In fact, God often doesn't give us the answer to that. And this psalm encourages us in the middle of trials to wait. Another thing that this psalm encourages us to do is to put our hope exclusively in God. The psalmist uses this word alone multiple times. For God alone my soul waits. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. And then he says later on in the psalm, put no trust in these other things. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Don't put your hope in anything other than God alone. Our hope, as we've even talked about in the last few weeks, is not in the fact that our trials are not that bad. Our hope is not that the virus won't take that many lives, or even that locally, like the earthquakes we've been experiencing, will not do that much damage. Our hope is not in those things, but instead exclusively in the God who promises to save us. He alone is our rock and our salvation and our fortress. So I think this psalm just helps us to set our minds and our hearts in the right direction in the middle of trials. So that's the main reason that we've chosen to memorize it together. Just a few notes on the outline here. As you can see, even the way that we've typed it up, 1 through 4, 5 through 8, and then 9 through 12. These are our three sections. The Selahs that the psalmist uses help us to divide those very clearly. And we'll look further on down the road about some other different themes in each of the sections as well. So that'll be more to come. Then the only other outlining thing I wanted to point out is that verses 1 and 2, and then verses 5 and 6 are nearly parallel. It's like the refrain of the psalm, and will hopefully be one of the things that you can't get out of your mind, that you can't get out of your head, this idea of your soul waiting for God alone, because he's the source of our salvation. He's the source of our hope, and it's only because we are securely fastened to him that we won't be shaken. He's the immovable fortress of our hope and salvation. So those two things, once we memorize 1 and 2, 5 and 6 are slightly different. And there's, I think, some cool things about that are in the differences, but you will have nearly memorized 5 and 6 as well. So how are we going to go about this? Well, there's a lot of different ways that we could use to memorize, but the way that I've always done, and I'm open to other suggestions down the road, but for Psalm 62, we're going to use what I used growing up, which is what my dad taught me to do, and he simply called it the 25-20, 15-10-5. And that means that on day 1, we'll say verse 1 25 times. And so we'll just take one verse at a time and say that first verse 25 times. On day 2, we'll say verse 2 25 times, and we'll say verse 1 20 times. So 25-20. And then as you can kind of see the pattern perhaps emerging, on day 3, we'll say verse 3 25 times, verse 2 20 times, and verse 1 15 times. And that pattern will continue going throughout the rest of the verses, 25-20, 15, 10, and then 5 as well. We'll do 5. Once we start verse 5, then we would go down to saying verse 1 5 times. And so what that does is it not only helps us to keep moving and introducing new verses, but it helps us to review the verses that we've already looked at. And once we have a full section memorized, we'll spend some time just reviewing that section as a whole so that we can keep the outline running in our minds. So we'll post 3 videos a week, a verse per video, so it'll be 3 verses per week, which means that with 12 verses total, this is going to take us 4 weeks to memorize together. So I'm excited to spend the next month working on Psalm 62 with you. So for today and tomorrow, before we post the next video on Wednesday, I just encourage you to read this through many times, even 5-10 times a day for the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, and write down questions about it. If there are things that you're wondering, or things that you notice, observations that you make, words that are used multiple times, or something that's confusing to you, just write those things down. And as we go through the verses systematically, hopefully we'll begin to answer some of those questions. And if you're someone that says this is too intimidating, there's no way that I can memorize this, I just encourage you, just go along. Spend some time meditating on these things. Even go ahead and say it 25, 20, 15, 10, 5 times. And we'll see if that doesn't help as far as the memorization. Just take it one step at a time. And if nothing else, just allow these truths to saturate your heart and your mind. And we'll look forward to seeing what God does in our own hearts through this together. God bless you.